Now, over the past few weeks, we've had a series of domestic violence cases in which women, and in one case a child, have lost their lives. Oftentimes, when these things happen, we wonder what could have caused it, and more importantly, how can we as a society prevent it from happening again? Joining us to talk more about this is the president of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Ms. Roberta Clarke. Ms. Clarke, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us on Now.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for having me, Kimberly.
Now, Ms. Clarke, before we actually jump into the discussion, I wanted to get just your opinion or your definition on domestic violence, because I believe recently the definition would have changed a bit, right?
Well, it hasn't really changed. I think what had changed was the eligibility of persons within a range of domestic relationships to access the court for protection orders. But basically, domestic violence includes physical, psychological, emotional, sexual abuse in the context of domestic relationships, and that is interpersonal, intimate relationships like spouses, married persons, people living in common law unions, people who are in visiting relationships, people who are dating, relationships between parents and children also constitutes domestic relationships, or any familial relationship in the context of a household is covered by the Domestic Violence Act, and all those persons are eligible to apply for protection orders.
Right. I wanted to get the point across about the children as well, because I think when we think about domestic violence, we just think spouses. But of course, it is that domestic area that is really affected. Now, we've had 4 women murdered, Ms. Clarke, and I know that you like to call their names. So we've had Stephanie Calbeo, we've had Abeyo Kojo, we've had Ellen Trishana Mohammed, and of course Marva Sutherland. And let's not forget little Levi Lewis as well, who was also a victim. Was there anything that could have been done differently to save the lives of these women and this child?
Okay, so I don't know the details of each of those cases, but we do know that domestic violence in the context of intimate relationships, the signs of domestic violence start pretty early in most relationships, and they may start with controlling behavior, excessive jealousy and possessiveness, abuse and intimidation, hostile words. It starts like that and escalates into all sorts of physical and sexual violence. So we know there's a pattern to how the violence progresses, the abuse progresses. Many people will go to their family members first to disclose that they are victims. Then they can go to the police, they may go to their faith-based institutions, and they go to the courts. But we do know that, in fact, many, particularly women, who are the majority of the victims of domestic violence, suffer in silence. But when they do go to family members and to the police, for example, we know that there are things that have to be done. The first thing is that we have to believe victims. We have to listen to them carefully and non-judgmentally and help them get out of situations of harm. We know in some of these cases of the victims that you've just spoken about that they may have already gone to the police or even had protection orders, but that avenue did not save them, and we ask the question why.
So, Ms. Clarke, if we are asking the question why, I mean, how is it that they had these protection orders and it wasn't, effective?
Okay, so a few things. I said I asked the question why rhetorically. Of course, we do need to know the facts more specifically in those cases. But we know that over the many years, there is some challenge for all police to act consistently and seriously in response to allegations of domestic violence or reports of domestic violence. And so we can find sometimes police still not responding appropriately, still sending home women back to their abusers, not following up, not investigating, particularly when allegations of a crime have been committed. Now, not all domestic violence incidents amount to crimes in law. Emotional abuse may not, depending on what it is, but certainly physical assaults, sexual assaults, many forms of harassment do constitute criminal actions. And so what we've been saying at the Coalition Against Domestic Violence is that apart from referring women to apply for protection orders, referring them to the court to apply for protection orders, the police have a stand-alone duty to investigate crime, charge where appropriate, and prosecute. And we're also saying that that moment of arresting is also a moment to bring social service intervention to perpetrators. so that in fact they receive psychological counseling, the risk assessments are undertaken so we understand how lethal they are, what is the likelihood that they will perpetrate significant harm, continue to perpetrate significant harm on others. So policing really very, very important. When they get to court, the Domestic Violence Act is intended to deliver a protection order within a few weeks, but we have cases that are in court for over a year. The longer they stay in court, the higher the likelihood of violence, the continued violence. So we also say court processes have to be much more speedy. And then once you have a protection order, the police have to support the implementation of a protection order. Really, very importantly, the use of these electronic surveillance bracelets, which has been introduced, and we think that that has to be used much more widely so that police and victims are alerted when perpetrators are coming into the areas where victims and their families are living. That will help to take preventative action.
Of course. Now, Ms. Clarke, I know one of the things that they use with the prosecution, of course, is evidence. And sometimes they need that first-hand report from the wives or the victims. But sometimes when the victims, when it's time to actually prosecute, they kind of shy away from doing that. I mean, is there anything else the police can use apart from that to ensure that these perpetrators get some form of, action?
Kimberly, when people are murdered, the person who is the victim is not there to give evidence, but the police still know how to investigate. And so it's not, you don't have to rely only on the victim. There are people around who witness, family members who know. There are many different ways to get your evidence around harm that has been perpetrated in a home. I think it's very wrong to over-rely on victims to support prosecution because victims remain in situations of fear and situations of dread. They may also be financially dependent. There's a whole sort of complication around people who are complicating circumstances around people who experience domestic violence, and so to over-rely on them for prosecution, I think is quite unfair and keeps, in fact, victims trapped. And we also do know that many victims are also quite reluctant to support the police, not only because of, emotional attachment, some forms of dependency, fear is a big one, but also because of children. Having said all of that, all of us in society have an interest in stopping domestic violence. So to some extent, regardless of not or whether or not the victim and their family may want to support a prosecution, the police have an independent responsibility to do that, particularly where physical and sexual assaults have been committed. So that's, and the police do know how to investigate without, the victim, because they do that all the time in situations of murders.
Right. Now, Ms. Clarke, I was reading that sometimes some of the barriers or some of the gaps that we might see in the system when addressing domestic violence is things like the measurement of the prevalence of domestic violence, adequate research in other domains, and of course, treatments of victims, which remain large gaps. How can we close these gaps and really address some of those issues?
Yeah, no, I think the first thing that we are insisting on, apparently not successfully, is that there has to be a plan. There has to be a whole of government plan. There has to be a whole of society plan, because of course, ending domestic violence also involves cultural change. So there has to be a national strategy, and that strategy has to include policing, include administration of justice, include housing, include social protection, include the healthcare system. It has to be the education sector. The plan has to touch all of those sectors, and it has to be well resourced so that in fact we can implement the plan. We have been calling on this for a national strategy for quite a while. We understand that there's a draft national strategy that has been sitting somewhere since 2014, and we said, there's no easy fix here, but we do have to have the plan, and we have to have benchmarks along the way to know if we're achieving the plan. What we have now are discrete and sometimes disjointed efforts, important efforts, but still perhaps without the level of coordination that we need to cover victims with the protection, the comprehensive protection that they and their families need. And we also don't actually have the plan around prevention.
Ms. Clarke, I'm glad that you mentioned education as part of the whole of government's approach to dealing with this, because there has been some conversation surrounding, bringing this sort of domestic violence awareness into schools. I just wanted to get your thoughts on this.
Yes, it's not just awareness. Awareness is important. It's also services, because there are children who are going to school who are experiencing domestic violence themselves. It's being perpetrated against them. But also, as the Domestic Violence Act recognizes, a child witnessing domestic violence is being harmed, is also a victim of domestic violence. So the school is also a place of early detection and early intervention. Um, but beyond that, we think that the school is a place where we are all socialized. We receive values within the school sector. Values are transmitted. The culture that we want in society is transmitted primarily through school, also, of course, through families as well. But school is a really an important place for transmission of values. How do we imbue the values of empathy and equality in the school system? How do we ensure that children are treated with the kindness which does not, with the kindness that reinforces their self-esteem, their self-confidence, so that they too can stand up to domestic violence in the home, or if it's being committed against them as they get into older adolescence and youth, where they are entering intimate relationships. So we think that the education sector is really important to embed the values that are important to prevent domestic violence, most importantly, gender equality, but also empathy and respect. And that has to be also imbued in the teaching practice, in the curriculum and in the teaching practice.
Ms. Clarke, when we talk about domestic violence, we often think about women, right? Because of course they are the predominant gender that often come forward with, instances of domestic violence against them. But we can also talk about gender-based violence in terms of men also being the victims as well. But we've been seeing that sometimes men, they go to the police station and they try to report these crimes, and sometimes they're not really taken serious. I mean, how serious of an issue is this?
Well, all violence is serious, whether it's perpetrated against one person or 1,000. So it is a serious issue. What we do know, of course, here in Trinidad and Tobago and everywhere, that domestic violence is very much caused by inequalities between women and men, inequalities around power and access to resources. And violence itself is used to control, so that control women into submissiveness. And when you hear the stories of domestic violence, these patterns of power and control of men over women, very much part of the fact patterns. But that does not mean that men can't experience domestic violence. And as you say, importantly, children experience domestic violence from both parents. And so we are saying that police have a responsibility to respond to all reports of domestic violence with seriousness, intentionality, and urgency. That's really our bottom line. And we also do know that we do need to have social services, psychoeducational services for victims regardless of their gender. One thing we want to point out within the Coalition Against Domestic Violence and all kinds of NGOs in this country, that the Domestic Violence Act does not equally apply to all persons regardless of sexual orientation, and that is something that we need to change. Everyone should be entitled to and is entitled to equal protection.
Good, because I also wanted you to address the LGBTQIA community as well, and I think you were able to just sum it up there for us. So thank you so much, Ms. Clarke.
Yes, it's a big issue, and
it is a big
issue. Any understanding why this discrimination continues, and why Parliament is allowing this discrimination to continue. That people who are in same-sex intimate partnerships cannot access the courts to get protection. What's that about? That discrimination has to come to an end.
Well, Ms. Clarke, thank you so much for joining us here on Now. I'm so happy that we had you back this second time and that we can pick your brain a little bit about some of the issues that we've been seeing in society. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. I just want to remind anyone who is watching who may be a victim or know someone who's a victim, please call 800-SAVE. That is the national hotline. And the Coalition Against Domestic Violence can be reached at 624-0402.
Thanks again, Ms. Clarke. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
And that was Ms. Roberta Clarke, the president of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, just sharing, the relationship between domestic violence and, of course, the law, and how you can get protection if you ever feel as if you're in a situation where you need to be, protected against.